In the face of economic and political crises, and in the shadow of nuclear annihilation, the anti-war movement has evaporated. Now, Professor Michel Chossudovsky of the Center for Research on Globalization is calling for a new movement of counter-propaganda and activism to delegitimize the lies that prop up the military-industrial complex. This is the feature interview on GRTV with your host James Corbett and our special guest, Michel Chossudovsky. Welcome, friends. This is James Corbett, CorbettReport.com, reporting for Global Research TV at grtv.ca. Today we're talking once again to the director of the Center for Research on Globalization, Michel Chossudovsky of globalresearch.ca. Mr. Chossudovsky, thank you for joining us once again.
Delighted to be on the program. I think that the issue of nuclear war today is ultimately the central issue because, first of all, we're at a very dangerous crossroads. There's confrontation between the United States and its allies on the one hand and Russia, China on the other. There are threats to use nuclear war, and nuclear war is portrayed by the decision makers as harmless to the surrounding civilian population. It's a peacemaking undertaking, and that is sheer lies and propaganda. What people have to understand is that a nuclear war is terminal. To quote Carl Sagan, who wrote on the nuclear winter, and I quote, "In a 2-megaton explosion over a fairly large city, buildings would be vaporized, people reduced to atoms and shadows, outlying structures blown down like matchsticks, and raging fires ignited. And if the bomb were exploded on the ground, an enormous crater, like those that can be seen through a telescope on the surface of the moon, would be all that remained where Midtown once had been." There are many other analysts who have focused on nuclear war. There's a large body of science. There's an analysis of nuclear doctrine. It is abundantly clear, as Fidel Castro actually stated a few years back, in a nuclear war, the collateral damage would be the life of all humanity. And people have to understand those realities because the media, the global media, the corporate media is telling us a bunch of lies. When we talk about using nuclear weapons against North Korea, that would be the annihilation not only of North Korea, but also South Korea. Because the distance between the capital, South Korea, Seoul, and the border with North Korea is about the same as Manhattan to New Jersey. People don't understand the geography. And of course, there would be radiation over large areas. So I think the issue there is what kind of activism should we be speaking about? All the protest movements which we've experienced in recent years, going back to the war on Iraq, have been an utter failure. The U.S. anti-war movement is dead. The anti-war activists, the leaders of the anti-war activists, are in fact often paying lip service to these so-called humanitarian wars of the U.S. administration and its European allies. So that is the issue. How do we articulate a coherent anti-propaganda or counter-propaganda process, and how do we implement it? And how do we ultimately reverse the tide? The thing is that the state is privatized. I think we know that. Politics is privatized. Then the question is, how do we restore a decision-making level, a decision-making process within the realm of politics, which will ultimately undermine nuclear war and which will dismantle the military-industrial complex, close down the weapons factories, and we're not only talking about nuclear war, we're talking about biological and chemical warfare, which is very advanced. with companies like Monsanto involved. We're talking about electromagnetic warfare, which is very advanced. It's another area of discussion. And we're also talking about the whole realm of economic warfare. The fact that financial instruments can ultimately lead to the downfall or the destabilization of national economies, and in turn leading to the impoverishment of large sectors of the population. So these are the issues that we have to be addressing. And then the question is, how do we do it? The legitimacy of these of this military and economic agenda ultimately relies on propaganda. Without propaganda, they have no leg to stand on. Without the war on terrorism, which is a legend, it's a legend because the terrorists are creation of U.S. intelligence. Without the war on terrorism, there is no legitimacy for bombing Syria and Iraq. Okay, we have to go after the bad guys, the bad dudes, ISIS, and so on. In fact, everybody knows that Al-Qaeda and ISIS, people who have studied it, know that those entities are supported covertly by the United States and its allies, financed and so on and so forth by Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and so on. But that does not necessarily trickle down to the broader public. And then some people say, well, the broader public is ignorant. The broader public is not ignorant. It's the media and the system which instills that ignorance. It's an engineered process of manipulation of public opinion. There are two things that we need to implement, and urgently. One is to inform the public, the broader public. But two, to question the legitimacy of this criminal undertaking. Okay? It's a collusive attempt to commit crimes against humanity on a mass scale. And that means we should also be thinking about a movement to close down the weapons factories, the assembly lines of these nuclear bombs. And I must say, question the legitimacy of people in high authority who are actually planning this. These are criminals. And then eventually what has to be done is to replace the government with something which doesn't necessarily represent strictly the war makers and the military-industrial complex and the weapons factories, what are called the defense contractors. They're not defending anything. That is the process. And then we have to say, well, what kind of mechanism do we undertake to actually challenge the legitimacy of these political and military actors and to reveal the true face of the American empire? Because we're really talking about the criminalization of foreign policy, what they call foreign policy, which is war.
The criminalization of the empire, perhaps, but how do we organize that form of activism? Because as you point out, the anti-war movement has been completely obliterated and eviscerated in recent decades, and there doesn't seem to be any concern amongst the public at this point. Is this to be organized institutionally or through direct action, or in what way?
Well, first of all, I think we have to scrap the existing anti-war movement, which is largely funded by the same corporations which are supporting the war. Okay, so the Rockefeller Foundation funds the anti-war movement, and at the same time they fund the whole process of building U.S. foreign policy. So it's a very convenient process. It's very subtle, but you can't have a coherent grassroots mass organization which is funded by the people that you're targeting, or the institutions or corporations which you're targeting. It's a non sequitur. So that what we have to do is to first of all to ensure that whatever movement we're developing has to be completely independent and self-financing. We have to break down partisan divisions within those movements. We're not dealing with, the Democrats, the Republicans, the communists, whatever. That's not the issue. This is a mass movement. It's a people's movement, and it is not linked to any particular political affiliation. That's very important. Then we have to start ultimately questioning the narrative. Okay, they'll say, "Oh, we have to go after bin Laden because he has nuclear weapons." I'm not exaggerating. That was raised during the Obama administration. Say Al Qaeda has nuclear weapons, we have to go after them. It's a nonsensical proposition. It's a lie. But eventually, eventually, the people who tell us these lies have to be removed from office. It's as simple as that. Now, is it a Bastille type of process? Call it what we want, but we can't continue with the type of politics that we have. The broader public has to be informed, has to wage that campaign of unseating the war criminals, but it is also a question of undoing the propaganda within the political and military apparatus, where people are indoctrinated. Most people in the US Senate probably and in the Congress are good people. They believe that the war on terrorism is true. Okay? They are the victims of their own propaganda. And they will say, yes, we have to go after the terrorists. And it's a worthwhile process. They don't understand that this is a war of conquest, necessarily. And if they do, they probably would rather forget about it. And so we have a situation where we should not only inform the broader public through counter-propaganda, but we should also ensure that people within the armed forces, within the government, I'm talking about federal, state, municipal, at different levels in different countries, within the government, within institutions, within business organizations, within corporations, that these people should eventually be sensitized and informed. People working at Lockheed Martin must be informed. They work for a company which is ultimately going to blow up the planet, and they should be informed. And they believe their own propaganda, and they also maybe they believe, well, we're selling it to the Pentagon, and the Pentagon will ultimately decide whether they want to use it or not. It's not our problem. No, there are many different layers of action that we have to envisage, but we have to recognize that the existing anti-war movement is weakened and divided. It doesn't have the organizational capabilities to wage this campaign, and it is co-opted. Okay, it is co-opted, and it is often, if you look at recent developments, you see that the anti-war movement is actually taking a stance in favor of Washington in relation to Syria. And it considers that Syria is a civil war, so we don't need to take any kind of anti-war commitment because they're fighting among themselves and we're just trying to help them. So that kind of narrative, which underlies an important segment of the anti-war movement, including prominent progressive intellectuals, we have to exclude these people from the anti-war movement. Okay, they are in favor of war, and they are supportive of the war on terrorism, and the war on terrorism is a lie. So that in fact, what they will say in relation to Syria is we're against the war, but we support the campaign against terrorism. It's a contradictory statement, because the campaign against terrorism is ultimately a pretext for waging a war of conquest. So there we have to start really streamlining, but I would say we have to build right from the ground. It's not an easy process, but it is an absolutely essential process, and it has to get underway. And if it doesn't get underway, the future of this planet is very bleak. So we're really up in terms of very, very historical battle. It's the battle for truth, and when the lie becomes the truth, there's no moving backwards. When the lie becomes the truth, and critical analysis is suppressed, differences of opinion are suppressed. When facts are suppressed, then we are in an inquisitorial environment. It's not simply a police state. It's an environment where people don't think. They don't have an inner consciousness. And it is reminiscent of the witch hunts of the Spanish and French Inquisition, but it's much more sophisticated, because it tells us anything that comes from high authority and which is then picked up by the New York Times and the Washington Post is the indelible truth. It goes into the news chains, and every single local station will replicate it. And if anybody says, no, this doesn't sound right, they will automatically be put on a blacklist as a conspiracy theorist, a bit like the witches of the Middle Age in Spain.
Now available from globalresearch.ca. The threat of nuclear war. The destabilization of foreign countries. The movement to resist this worldwide aggression. These are the topics addressed in The Globalization of War, America's Long War Against Humanity, the new book by award-winning author Professor Michel Chossudovsky.
America's hegemonic project in the post-9/11 era is the globalization of war, whereby the US-NATO military machine, coupled with covert intelligence operations, economic sanctions, and the thrust of regime change, is deployed in all major regions of the world. The threat of preemptive nuclear war is also used to blackmail countries into submission. This long war against humanity is carried out at the height of the most serious economic crisis in modern history. It is intimately related to a process of financial restructuring, which has resulted in the collapse of national economies and the impoverishment of large sectors of the world population. The ultimate objective is world conquest under the cloak of human rights and Western democracy.
Buy your copy today and discover what is being hailed as a must-read and diplomatic dynamite. Available now at globalresearch.ca or wherever fine books are sold.